Is the US falling behind in the race for electric vehicles? That was the question the country's public broadcaster NPR posed at the end of last year. And earlier this month, the US government quadrupled its import duties on Chinese EVs. But will this be enough for American companies to catch up in the electric vehicle race? This week on Deep Dive, I spoke with Lee Kemp, an American commentator and comedian, to get his perspective on America's concerns over its car industry. This episode is brought to you on Friday, May the 31st. So, Lee, do you drive an EV yourself?
Yes, I do have an EV. I've had it for about a year now.
What about people around you? Like, are electric cars a common transportation method in the States?
I mean, you definitely see a fair number of Teslas, but I looked it up, and even with a bunch of Teslas around and things like that, it's less than 1% of the American population drive EVs. Despite the cost of gasoline, despite climate crisis, it's still a tiny number. And, one of the big reasons is that we don't have the infrastructure for it. There's not a lot of charging stations.
Right.
There's more for Teslas, but for cars that are not Teslas like mine, it's actually pretty tough to find a charger because the U.S. government doesn't seem to care to actually create an infrastructure for EVs.
The traditional cars run by gasoline are still the dominant transportation for most people. So given the low rate of electric vehicles in the States, I guess probably Chinese electric cars will probably be even rarer to see. I'm wondering, have you ever seen any Chinese electric cars running on the road?
I don't think I have, but I'm also not a car expert of other cars, so I might not have recognized that they were Chinese EVs. But with Biden and Trump arguing over who can raise the tariffs the most, having 100 or 200% tariffs makes it just about impossible to get a Chinese EV, I guess.
I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't noticed any Chinese EVs in the past, because I read this number from the Chinese customs. I believe in last year, Chinese EV exports to the US only accounted for less than 1% of all Chinese EV exports, which is just about 10,000 cars that were sold to the US. Yeah,
across the entire US.
Yeah. So given this very low presence of Chinese electric cars in the States, like, why is the US government waging a trade war against this, let's say, a minority product?
Right, that's the big question, right? If it's such a tiny number, why is the U.S. government freaking out right now in a time with wars going on around the world and people struggling and Americans struggling to pay their bills? Why is the U.S. government freaking out over Chinese EVs that are such a minuscule number in the United States? And as even U.S. propaganda magazine The Atlantic said, well, Chinese EVs are, as they said, sleek and reliable and cheap, like excellent cars and affordable. And the U.S. is very scared of that, apparently. And, the big reason, which people don't want to get into, because let me just make the point that if living in the United States, anyone who's lived here knows that everything is made in China. Like shower curtains and baseball bats and shoes and clothes and the costume you get for your cat that you dress her up in that you like to put her in, but she doesn't like it all. All of that is made in China. So why is it the U.S. government is only angry about specific things, EVs, solar panels?
Right.
And it's really because the U.S. does not want things that decrease use of fossil fuels. And cheap, affordable electric vehicles would heavily decrease the use of fossil fuels, as would reliable, cheap solar panels.
Because they were clean technologies.
Clean technologies are the thing. The U.S. government doesn't care about the costumes for the cats. They only care about the things that decrease the use of fossil fuels.
Right. We have already seen the tariff on Chinese electric cars. And then you also brought up the hostility against the Chinese solar panels. And the one thing they have in common is that they are both renewable energies, like future technologies. So that makes people think, was this bound to happen due to the fact that America is actually the largest oil producer currently in the whole world?
Right. America is a massive oil producer, but on top of that, it gets even deeper, pun intended, as they drill for oil. It gets even deeper because the US currency is based on fossil fuels. It's called the petrodollar. And the reason the US can print as much money as we want, we can make up dollars every single day, and our money doesn't lose value, is because a lot of oil, most oil around the world, is sold and bought in US dollars, which also is why the US dollar is the global reserve currency. So if fossil fuels stop getting sold or stop being sold in US dollars, then the US dollar loses a great deal of its power. And the US would no longer be able to print trillions of dollars every year, just make up money out of thin air, at least not without causing the currency to lose a large amount of value. So that at the root of it, that's the real reason. And the U.S. clearly does not care at all about climate change.
Traditionally, the donors, they have quite a heavy influence in the U.S. politics, but I think so far the oil companies have primarily been the contributors for the Republican Party. Why is the current Democratic administration is also defending the interests of the oil tycoons? Because Democrats are presumably more supportive and open to green technologies.
Well, Democrats talk, so they say things that they don't mean. I mean, both sides do. But Democrats may say they care more about green technologies, but then at the end of the day, President Obama laid more oil pipeline than any president before him. And quietly, he bragged about laying enough oil pipeline to encircle the earth 3 times around. So that's one of the big Democrats, right? And he was quietly big into oil production. And in terms of the donations to these political candidates, which, donations is a nice word that really means bribes. The reason the donations are a little more to the Republicans, that is true, from big oil funds Republicans a little more, but there is plenty of donations that go to the Democrats. On top of that, much of corporate America is all linked together. So big oil is linked together with big banks. Big banks fund big oil. They give them loans. They make money from big oil, and big banks fund both political parties. So that's just one example of how these corporate entities are all linked together, and they fund both sides of the 2-party system in the United States, which is actually, if you get to the root of it, one party.
But despite the dominance in the oil industry, America is still home to one of the world's largest EV companies, Tesla, right? But in general, the US car industry seems to be feeling threatened, fear of Chinese electric cars. Why is that?
Well, when we talk about Tesla, let's remember that Tesla has plenty of problems of its own. Tesla, of course, the Cybertruck has been a bit of a disaster, but that aside, Tesla, until I think 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, was only making a profit because they were selling their carbon credits to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So the only reason they were making money was because they were selling carbon credits, the ability for other companies to spit out carbon into the atmosphere. So they've only become, profitable recently, and there's a lot of issues going on with Tesla. So those who hold it up as the best thing in the world, I think, are a little confused.
But how about the American electric car industry in general? Are there other competitors in the EV industry like Tesla does?
In terms of American cars, I mean, I haven't really kept up with it. The EV I own is not American, but I think they're starting to catch up. I think there are some American car companies putting out some okay EVs, but there's, as we were saying before, there's really been no push to have EVs.
Right.
There's very little infrastructure in the United States. The U.S. government isn't providing enough subsidies to really change things. And so even with climate change being a major issue for the past 20 years, you still have less than 1% of American drivers having an EV.
Like you said earlier, I recall just about 1% of all the cars running on the road.
Yeah, less than 1%, yeah.
And before this time, the rollout of the recent tariff against the Chinese EVs, there were actually already discussions, concerns. At the end of last year, NPR had a report asking if the US is falling behind in the race to electric vehicles. There seems to be a consensus that America needs to speed up in electric cars. Do you think US will be able to catch up in this race of EV?
I think it's unlikely, but I also go back to my point that secretly the US government does not want to succeed at EVs. And not only do they want to stop EVs, they want to stop other countries from doing well with EVs. Hence the tariffs on Chinese EVs. So the US government may talk about dealing with climate change, getting off fossil fuels, renewable energy, renewable vehicles. But if you look at their actions, if you look at how they actually behave, they don't want those things. They don't want cheap, affordable solar panels. They don't want EVs. They don't want batteries that allow for these things. They're putting massive tariffs on China to stop that stuff. And at the heart of it, and not many people are talking about this, at the heart of it, it's because the U.S. has an existential risk if people stop using fossil fuels.
So it's the heavy reliance on the traditional fossil fuels that's actually keeping the US government from embracing clean technologies. Thank you, Lee, for joining us.
Absolutely.
The EU Commission has reportedly postponed its decision on Chinese EV tariffs until after the European Parliament election on June the 9th. In contrast, major automobile companies are taking a cooperative approach to Chinese electric vehicles. BMW sent half of its board of directors to attend the Shanghai Auto Show last year, while Volkswagen has established a partnership with Xiaopeng to combine their powers. As Chinese EVs expand their presence on the global stage, they will inevitably encounter both resistance and acceptance. But ultimately, the market will decide who prevails in the end. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Deep Dive. If you enjoyed what you just heard, don't forget to follow us on your podcast platform. Just search for Deep Dive. You can also leave comments to let us know what you want to learn about China and beyond. This episode is brought to you by me, Li Yunqi, and my colleagues Zhang Zhang and Qi Zhi. Special thanks to Lee Camp. I'll see you in the next one.